Okay, hi everyone. You're very welcome to the teacher webinar this evening. We had a parent webinar last night and we had nearly 70 people, so it's great to see another big turnout. Our three talks today are going to be about supporting neurodivergent children in school. So that means children who have thinking, learning and social difficulties and differences. So this includes autistic kids, children with FASD, ADHD, Tourette's, DLD, epilepsy, or children born prematurely, just to name a few. So we're coming at these topics from research and professional experience. Sinead is going to talk about the Edinburgh Psychoeducation Intervention for children. She's going to talk about the principles of that and how to use it and where to get resources for that from. And we've actually put the link for downloading the resources already in the chat. It just takes 30 seconds to download. You just have to fill in a quick form about where you're from and things like that, just so we know kind of who the booklets are useful for. And then Miranda's going to talk about supporting children to develop a positive identity and self-advocacy skills. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about supporting neurodivergent girls through puberty. All right, so we're going to just go through the talks one after the other and at the end do questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll monitor them and hopefully answer them all at the end. So we were actually surprised at how many people registered for this event. So that's why we were asking in the chat there to put your school, where your school is, and if it's primary or secondary school, and how you heard about it, because we're trying to figure out how best to reach people. So if you could just put that in the chat, what school you're from, primary or secondary school, where and how you heard about it. And then finally, if you want to be contacted in the future about other events like this, please just email me, the email at the end there, and I will add you to our mailing list. Okay, so Sinead is going to get started now.
Okay, so first slide, please, Ailbhe. So I'm going to talk about the Edinburgh Psychoeducation Intervention for Children, or EPIC, as it's become known. And this started out as a research project where we developed a research project both from the research evidence, but also we co-produced this work with children themselves, their teachers and other educational professionals, as well as parents and a wide range of clinicians. Over the last year or so, we've been developing another option, which is what we call a self-delivery with support from the EPIC team option, whereby parents and teachers with support could deliver this. And we're hoping that this will be released next year. For now, today, I'm going to focus on the resources that are available. You'll see them in the link below, and they're available to download. They're booklets for both understanding neurodivergent conditions, but also for supporting. So there's a specific strategy book for teachers. At the moment, those booklets are condition specific, so they refer to ADHD and deicde, but we know most of these children have other conditions and they're suitable for children with a wide range of difficulties. And indeed, we're currently developing a new booklet that will be generic to neurodivergent children. And these can be used with children with a wide variety of thinking, learning, and learning difficulties. They're also supplemented by a blog where we have written information that describes in more detail how to use the blog. The booklets can be used both for children who have a diagnosis, but they're also suitable for children who haven't received a diagnosis, either because they're on a waiting list or because they didn't quite meet criteria. Our research shows that children who are on a waiting list and assessed still show the same kind of level of difficulties. So next slide, please, Ailbhe. I'm just going to talk through the three practices of EPIC. Now, these practices Profiling, so identifying the difficulties. Psychoeducation, so helping the child to understand their difficulties, and then pairing with strategies, can be conducted in a variety of ways. Many of them are more suitable for a one-to-one situation. So if the child has an additional support needs, assistant or teacher, or in a small group situation. But we actually really advocate doing a lot of these activities in a whole class situation. And I'm going to talk about some examples. I'm talking about understanding your memory and planning better. We know that in all children, these are things that are developing. And indeed, if we think about adults, we often forget things, and it's useful to use these strategies. So we really do advocate, where possible, also using them in a whole class and really teaching children about ways that they can enhance their thinking processes to support their learning. So the first aspect is profiling. Now, we do this within our research studies using standardized educational tasks, but we have activities in the booklets. These are games and activities that can be used to help identify the kind of difficulties children have. An example is if you're working with a child who has a diagnosis of ADHD, there's a tendency to assume that their difficulties are going to arise from attention. And we actually know that for many of these children, their cognitive or thinking difficulty often reflects a difficulty in memory or planning or some kind of combination of these. And for some children, of course, it'll be co-occurring autism symptoms. So having sensory difficulties and having a difficulty tuning out noises that is actually making them look like they have an attention difficulty. So if you look at the booklets, it gives ideas of how to work with the child and engage in activities to identify what are the range of difficulties, and indeed identify the strengths of the child to help overcome these difficulties. The second P is psychoeducation, and that is not necessarily understanding the child's condition. So if they have a label of ADHD, for example, but actually we take an individualized approach. So understanding the strengths and difficulties of that child as an individual. You'll know from working with children in your classroom that you could have 10 children with ADHD and they'll all look different from one another. And that often is due to the range and differences in their thinking difficulties that generically looks like an attention difficulty. And, whether there's co-occurring difficulties. The third P is pairing these difficulties with strategies, and particularly trying to draw on the strengths of the child. Now, the strategies that we advocate are things like internal strategies, like chunking or grouping items. We've got lots of examples of these in the booklets, or rehearsal, or planning using mind maps, but also external strategies, so like using timers, but in particularly using crafts and things of interest to the child to plan out the steps and stages of a task. If they're very creative, they can draw out these steps. And a really important aspect across all of these practices is dialogue, having continual conversation with the child about the difficulties that they have that they might find more difficult than their peers. And really EPIC is about helping the child, empowering them to understand their difficulties so that they can be upskilled to identify themselves the kind of strategies that they need to use, or to ask for help in identifying a strategy, so that they don't continually start tasks and just don't get started on it and become frustrated, that they actually have the equipment and skills in place so that they can make a good go at starting and hopefully staying on and indeed completing a task. Next slide, please, Ailbhe. I've already mentioned some of the key principles of EPIC, and so for example, the individual approach and really thinking about identifying that child's individual strengths and difficulties, which may or may relate to their diagnostic label. That may be useful in part. You may need to look beyond that. But a really important aspect is that for most of these children, they have multiple difficulties that is causing the thinking and learning difficulties that they have. So, we often, for example, with ADHD, think of attention. With deicde, dyspraxia, think of motor difficulties. With autism, we may think of social difficulties. But actually, we know these children often have multiple difficulties. So they may have difficulties in memory, attention, but also have sensory difficulties that are affecting their attention. Often what we first see with many of these children, and of course this is very, very true in a classroom situation, is the frustration and behavioral reactions, responses, and difficulties in regulating their emotions. And we advocate very strongly for thinking about the factors, the underlying factors that may have led up and built to this response, and thinking about the difficulties that may have got them in terms of engaging with you, engaging in the class, or starting a task, and thinking about whether that is then causing the difficulties with emotional regulation. So, for example, having to change from one task to another. As I've mentioned, psychoeducation, so the child really getting a good understanding of the strengths and difficulties is pivotal, and yourself and their parents. And we really advocate, dialogue between home and school, and taking a home and school-based approach with these activities. The strategies are very much game and activity-based and are based on materials that you should have in your classroom or at home. So we advocate doing things like playing Connect 4 with the child, or in whole class activities, doing something like Simon Says. Simon Says is a brilliant game for teaching children about how to stop and think, and how important it is to, in terms of being able to control or inhibit the responses, slowing things down in order to, more effectively finish that task. And then in the booklets, we transfer these to ideas around, more academic type tasks, and how the child might then, for example, do their maths with using a sort of stop and think time frame, or thinking about, being flexible when you're moving from doing addition to minus, that they're aware of that. If, for example, they have difficulty in being flexible from one aspect of a task to another. We really promote an active learning. Now, there's two, often when I say active learning, people are thinking of movement, and that's actually really important. In EPIC, we strongly advocate taking movement and sensory breaks. But also really what we mean by this in specific sense is the child being an active participant in their learning. And we advocate, and you're very likely to be doing things like this already, using items that are personalized to the child. So if they're very interested in Lego, using that to represent numbers, for example. So next slide, Ailbhe. So I'm going to now just move to the booklets. And some of you, I know from seeing emails come in, have already downloaded the booklets, and the links are indeed in the chat here as well. We have understanding booklets and a strategy booklet. The strategy booklet is specific for teachers, but in dialogue with parents, it can be used by parents. It's just some of the tasks are a bit class focused, and we actually are also developing a parent one at the moment. And in these booklets, we list areas of focus, and we would really advocate you sitting down with the child and going through what are the areas that we might work on a given day. Are we going to think about planning ahead today? Is this an area that we need to work on? And then, Ailbhe, if you go to the next slide, we have comparative strategy booklet, which is generic across conditions. And just to mention for people who've just sort of come on, the booklets that are around understanding neurodivergent conditions at the moment on our site are condition-specific, ADHD and deicde, but they can be used beyond that. And indeed, we are developing a more generic neurodivergent booklet. But this is the strategy booklet. And once you've identified areas that you want to work on, so whether that's planning and the stages in planning, or memory and staying on a task. Next slide, Ailbhe. You can then go into the strategy booklet and you'll see a range of choices that you can choose. So here, if you're thinking about staying on a task and looking at supporting the child's understanding and supporting the child's memory, you might go to page 25. And Ailbhe, if you click on the next slide, you'll see one of the examples of our memory pages, where these are really very straightforward things, and they're things that you can do in any class. The things that you can do with the child as an individual or small group, but there are also things that you can be doing with the child as part of the whole class. And actually, these are really useful for all children. But it's about really empowering the child to understand that they may need to do this a little bit more than their peers. And they may also, you and they may need to work together. Which of these things, or which combination of these things are useful or needed in a given situation, and really upskilling them to know that they need to ask. So, a real significant outcome of EPIC is, qualitative information we've received is where the teacher has commented that the child has asked in a new situation, I think I need a memory aid. Can we try, rehearsing or a mini whiteboard? And that's really the goal of EPIC, where the child knows that they need something, and even better, if they're able to help you identify what that might be. So here's some of the examples, and these come from the psychological literature in parts, but a lot of these examples come from our work with teachers. We engaged in a series of teacher workshops to identify and supplement information from the psychological literature and how we know how memory works with all the useful things that we know teachers are already doing. So next slide. And the next slide is me coming to an end. As I've mentioned, the booklets are available in the chat. Please do access them, and I hope you find this useful. And I'll pass you now on to Miranda.
Thank you, Sinead. Right, okay. So I know it's the end of a long school day, and I think kind of getting a continuation of this is talking about kind of neurodivergence and why are we talking about it. I suppose if we start off with the fact that at least in Scotland, we know that approximately 20% of every classroom will have children who are neurodivergent within it. And we know that schools are kind of key sites for children's learning, but obviously their well-being, and also to promote a kind of positive self-identity and a knowledge of themselves as well. So as we move through this, we're going to come across a lot of different terms. I'm going to attempt to maybe kind of give a little bit knowledge around those kind of constructs and the terms that we use, and in a very practical sense, how we can start to engage in those conversations with young people. Because I think what Sinead was talking about is that dialogue and making it really meaningful for a child as well. So Ailbhe, if you can move on to the next slide. Okay, so we see these terms a lot, neurodiversity, being neurotypical and neurodivergence. So instead of me just providing a big script of what they are, I thought this illustration by Sonny Hallett was really useful. Okay, so here you have a neurodiverse group of shapes. We've got octagons, rectangles, triangles, rectangles, and squares. Now, we've got the most common shape here, which is the square, okay, and they are typical. And then all the other different shapes are neurodivergent from the most common shape. Okay, so that's a really, really nice way of just explaining the differences. So in terms of our own society, school community, it is a neurodiverse kind of society. We all have different experiences. We all understand the world in different ways. It is a collection that applies to a school, to a community, to the wider society in general. When you have somebody who is neurodivergent, they often have this kind of often reflects the differences in their thinking, their understanding, their experiences in terms of social relationships and how they manage their experiences of the world. And it's often associated with diagnoses like intellectual disability, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, ADHD, autism, lots of different terms like that. Neurotypical refers to obviously our most common shape, which is the square, and that refers to the kind of assumption of a large group of people having a very similar way of processing information. Okay, so why do we have all these terms? Kind of what is it about the neurodiversity movement that's so important? Well, I think it really recognizes that each one of us will have different experiences and they're all to be valued equally. What we're really seeking to is provide a much more inclusive environment for children, for young people, for adults themselves, and to promote a kind of more inclusive culture of acceptance as well. And what we're seeking also is to encourage what Sinead was talking about, that kind of awareness of entitlement to adjustments, to supports, and encouraging young people to be advocates, so that it's not just always a particular role for a teacher or for a parent, but to develop those skills as we go along as well. Okay, thank you, Ailbhe. Okay, so with this, there's another kind of illustration I've attempted is to kind of provide an overview of how this might all kind of be joined up. Because sometimes I think when we hear all these different terms, and I've started on my own kind of PhD, kind of trying to process, you know, what is this term and how does it relate to different things, okay? So when we're talking about living with a disability, that's quite distinct because a disability can affect any person at any different time in their life. Sometimes we think about disability in particular, maybe like a physical disability or an intellectual disability, but actually there's lots of different terms for it. So what I'm going to start with at the heart of it is always the child and the adolescent. Okay, so what's meaningful, what's important to them, their experience of living with that disability, what does it look like to them? So when we're talking about disability, usually in education, we have the Equalities Act 2010, and that really refers to a physical or a mental impairment that has a substantial long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal day-to-day activities, okay? When we think about disability in terms of kind of more health, like from the World Health Organization, that disability usually tends to refer to a very specific health condition and its interaction within a wider environment with people, or it might be the kind of their access to day-to-day activities or their inclusion in kind of wider communities and environments as well. Now, a diagnosis, some people talk about going to CAMHS for a diagnosis or seeking that out. A diagnosis is just the medical term for lots of neurodevelopmental conditions that we often talk about. It can be a medical name for other health conditions as well, like cerebral palsy, Down syndrome. So it's a very specific, it's just a label or a name, okay, rather than a process. What I'm going to add in today is the concept of a disability identity. Okay, now anybody, you know, we all have our own kind of beliefs about ourselves, our own knowledge of ourselves. But as children are kind of, you know, they access school, that's their primary source, and they've got lots of sports, lots of activities maybe in their lives, and they've got family networks. But disability can be part of their understanding of their self and how they relate to them, how they kind of think of themselves and with others as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later as well. And what I've tried to do is really to house it under that concept of neurodiversity. So it can relate to all these different things, but it's really up to the individual as they mature and kind of with support to understand all these different terms. Okay. Now, when we have a diagnosis, whether whether a person identifies with a diagnosis or they just consider themselves neurodivergent or they have a disability, that does not exist in isolation. We know that, you know, there's other kind of important factors in there in terms of their context, of where they access their home, their school, their local community, the social support, their interactions with professionals as well. Okay, thank you, Ailbhe. So in a very kind of, I suppose, pragmatic way, what I suppose we wanted to do today is highlight the difference between these terms, sometimes how they could all fit together, but also starting those conversations, exploring that with children. Now, this would be in conjunction with parents as well, I understand that, but some young people and adolescents may come to you, may kind of disclose, oh, I've just had this diagnosis. And I think sometimes it's easier when you have a kind of script to hand or you're thinking about these different things. I know myself as an educational psychologist, I've had, you know, discussions as school staff around talking about autism, different things like that. But we've got all these different terms. So a neurodevelopmental condition. So just an idea to maybe start that conversation. If you have a neurodevelopmental condition, it means you might have a difference in the way you think and learn. It's very common. and it can affect how you plan and remember things or how you manage friendships. Diagnosis, I've kind of covered that as well, a name given to a neurodevelopmental condition such as ADHD, ASD, intellectual disability, FASD, DCD, lots of different terms out there. We know that disability is part of being human, can affect children and adults. Okay, it's a condition, and it can be, and I think taking the broad understanding of disability, it can be physical, mental health, and it can obviously include neurodevelopmental disorders. And it can make it more difficult for a person to do different things in their everyday lives that other people do. Okay, but people have a right to this. Okay, and that's very much part of, the UN Convention for Disability Rights as well. So I suppose having these conversations really helps for children to be aware that it is acceptable. Schools are starting to kind of acknowledge this place of inclusion and acceptance as well. And I think what's encouraging is that a lot of young people actually themselves would ask questions. So it's kind of just exploring that with young people and having those conversations with staff, with parents as well about it. Now, I've been doing some research with young people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and I actually found it came from directly their own words, how they best described it. And they were going through their experiences, and they were, discussing disability. I wasn't mentioning any terms or anything, and that's what they were starting to discuss. They were able to relate, what they would say to a friend about FASD. And I thought it was a really excellent way of explaining it. Okay. So they said, I would give them a definition of it, and I'd explain how it works and how it affects me as a person. And I'd give them some examples of like different times when we've been together, and you know how it's come about when my FASD has acted up or something. I try and give them as many personal experiences that they've had with me. Now, when I was working with the young people, they were also really good at explaining what FASD, how it came about, and the diagnosis itself to me. They said that FASD is like when some of your brain cells don't work properly, and the person that was carrying you when you were a baby, they were pregnant and they were drinking. So actually, young people themselves are a great source of information if you're not sure where to start in conversations as well. Okay. Thank you, Ailbhe. So coming back to that concept of disability identity formation. So why am I raising this? Sometimes we find that for ourselves, I mean, I'm including myself in this very much, that it can be quite abstract, kind of understanding disability. Do we have a real understanding of disability in our schools? Can it be quite an abstract concept? Okay. For those who maybe have a disability or they identify as being neurodivergent, what does that mean for them? How can we promote a more positive self-identity? And how can we have those conversations? Because actually, at the end of the day, what we want to do is ensure that those young people feel like they can ask for help and know how to do it appropriately as well. Okay, so there's different models. There's not a lot of research in this area around this, but there's various models with it. And what I found really helpful is Jennifer Gibson's model in 2006. And she talked about different phases. Now, this doesn't happen magically, as we know, in a linear process. And what you see in a lot of children and kind of moving into adolescence, it can move through this pattern and it can stop and it can remain in phase for a period of time. It can move around. Okay. So what you see with the first phases of passive awareness is a child maybe saying, yes, I have a diagnosis, or yes, I've got FASD, but not actually been able to relate it into a kind of sense of what does that actually mean for me? How does that impact my day-to-day life? Okay, and I'm not kind of suggesting a very convoluted chat. It's more like, yeah, I find it a bit tricky to read and write. So those kind of conversations that we probably already have around, children's strengths, their differences, their difficulties, and the areas that they need support with. Okay, so in that passive awareness stage, it can feel quite abstract for a child, and they can maybe say, yes, this is something I have, but it doesn't really kind of impact on my day-to-day life. You find that as children kind of enter kind of late childhood and moving into early adolescence, that the realization phase, particularly in school environments, their self-identity, their self-awareness in relation to peers is quite kind of noticeable. For some young people, they can feel like they don't want to disclose anything. That is quite a process, and I think it's recognizing that's where they are on that journey as well. Okay. I think providing, kind of knowing that there's a trusted adult there to kind of speak about these, and having those scripts to hand that when they do, or sharing information simply at this point, is absolutely fine. And if you ever want to talk about it, or here's some information that I've got, you read it in your time, and if you have any questions, come back to me. Over time, young people then start to evolve in their understanding, and for some, as they told me with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, they were talking about that in the study I was doing with them, that they moved into a sense of understanding that actually I do find these things quite tricky, and actually this is permanent for me, and it's maybe an invisible disability. People maybe don't know I have a disability, but actually it does, it affects, it means I can't go out all the time. And actually I do need an adult to help me kind of recap on the day. And you definitely notice with kind of in those later, more mature conversations that they start to identify the need for advocacy, and that they do, they do have rights, and that they do need to ask for help. But sometimes the confidence doesn't quite match within that. So in terms of supporting that kind of formation of a disability identity, information is key, providing support, and developing advocacy skills. Ailbhe, if you don't mind moving on to the next slide. Thank you. So just, I suppose, in terms of giving you a bit of background about having those conversations around knowledge of self, I'm using the example of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And we've got some kind of from a Scottish viewpoint, but they're, accessible to everybody. That's kind of on today. It's just understanding those conversations around strengths, differences, difficulties that Sinead has already referred to. So in terms of FASD, we've got those areas of executive functioning, sensory and motor issues, academic skills, brain structure, living and social skills, focus and attention, cognition, communication, and memory. So these are some aspects where young people might notice differences, they might notice some difficulties, but equally, they mightn't have issues in any of these areas either. It might be particular to some aspects of it. So it can be a really kind of helpful reference point, understanding different neurodevelopmental conditions as part of those conversations, and helping to inform that kind of broader sense of a child understanding themselves, their knowledge of themselves. So if we move on to self-advocacy, thanks, Ailbhe. Okay, so in order to teach self-advocacy, and that's something that we do, I think in schools, you really, I've had so many experiences, you have teachers been really, kind of promoting, their confidence and some kind of skills, but in particular about self-advocacy, from kind of literature, there's kind of two kind of key components. It's about knowledge and skills. Okay, so the first bit, and that I've kind of alluded to already, is self-knowledge. So is exploring the language around it, the different kind of constructs of neurodivergence. What does that mean? It has a place within a neurodiverse society. How do the young people identify? Is it kind of, do they know they have a diagnosis, or is it a conversation about strengths, difficulties, and needs? What kind of supports, adjustments do they feel would help them? Sometimes as part of that, I think it's really important to kind of make sure that we don't forget, what does the actual young person value? What's meaningful to them in that conversation? Is it about after school club? Is it about kind of looking at more social opportunities, making more friends? Is it about, kind of feeling a bit more confident in their learning? So it's kind of taking that into account and then making a really clear plan with the child and making sure that the child, and sharing that with the parent as well, but that they're really involved in that, okay? And that helps their confidence and their understanding of what's going on. Now, in terms of the skills of kind of self-advocacy, there's again kind of 4 kind of key components within that. And that's kind of developing skills of understanding, maybe, or potentially identifying there might be something going on here. So that identification that there is an issue. Eventually, I suppose, as teachers, you will kind of provide that scaffolding in terms of problem solving, okay, or having conversations around problem solving, offering, identifying that there might be an issue, suggesting kind of alternatives, or if there's choice in there, and then encouraging a much more kind of active engagement from the learner, from the child, to make choices, and then encouraging their communication skills as well, of how they would ask for help, like literally sometimes giving them scripts, and just talking through that about situations where they could practice that as well. Now, I think I'm at the end of my talk, so I'll just check with Ailbhe if I'm onto my last screen.
Yeah, I think you are.
Thank you very much.
Right. Do you want to say anything else?
No, I'm just saying I'm happy. I'll be monitoring chat for any questions that we'll have at the end. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Miranda. Okay, so I'm going to talk about supporting neurodivergent girls through puberty. So I'm just going to briefly talk about like when's a good time to explain this, how children are learning about periods, how to explain it, what attitude towards periods we should teach kids, and sensory issues, and try and give you some practical advice and give you some good resources to use. And this fits into relationships, sexual health, and parenthood education. So hopefully it'll be useful for that. Right, so when to explain. So the timing of first periods is becoming younger for everybody, and this has been a trend that has followed over the last century. So in the 1900s, it was around 13 and a half is when girls were getting their first period, but now it's around 12. And that does seem to be a kind of trend where it's continuing to get younger. It can be as young as 8 though. And there is some very preliminary evidence that says that autistic girls might be getting their period earlier than neurotypical girls. So for these reasons, it's good to think about that. Like it might not happen for girls today the way it did for you if you're thinking about yourself. The other thing is that learning about body changes and periods can require a lot of repetition for neurodivergent children. So for this reason, it's recommended to start talking about periods and body changes around 8 years of age. Right, so it's important to recognize that a lot of kids will learn about periods, boys and girls, through memes and TikTok and YouTube and Instagram. So sometimes images on TikTok and Instagram are over dramatic for humor, and all the time they're very funny, but like a kid might not understand this. So like there's this picture of Kim Kardashian and Kanye West kind of talking about the irrational girlfriend when she's on her period, which I've seen loads of times in my life. And then like this meme of like a really sore cramp. So I think it's good to like start here because it can be a good place to figure out where the kids already are, and then kind of work out any confusions or misinterpretations they already have. Right, so sometimes neurodivergent children are more anxious about their body changing. Autistic people tend not to like change. So that's another reason why starting education about puberty really early on is really good, because it can prevent shock and fear and embarrassment. So how to educate the kids in your class. So there's loads of really good resources on this website called the HOPE website on the University of Edinburgh website. And they have like teaching about puberty in loads of different formats. So they have videos, leaflets, books you can buy, And it also includes lesson plans you can use with the whole class. And then another thing to think about is like going through the practical steps when you're thinking about getting your period, and showing the kids what to do with the pads or how to open them. So saying like, okay, when you go to your local Tesco, this is usually where the pads are, or the tampons, showing how to open a packet, putting the pad on, showing them how to dispose of it as well. And then in terms of also teaching planning, you can also, it's a good idea to figure out with a neurodivergent girl who they can go to in the school if they do get their first period in school. And if you do find a particularly good resource that you find really worked well for teaching girls about periods, like you can tell the parents so they can use the same ones at home, so they're getting more repetition. So in terms of educating children, this is all children, girls and boys, about periods, like these kind of abstract images can be unhelpful. That can just kind of lead to confusion for everybody really, but in particular for kids with neurodevelopmental conditions. So these images that are used often for pad ads of like blue liquid, like it is confusing because obviously it's never going to look like that, it's going to look like blood. Or these kind of abstract symbolic images using like strawberries, or this picture of this lady and this girl, like it's very unclear what's actually happening. So yeah, try to avoid these images. There's this really good book called The Autism Friendly Guide to Periods, but it's perfectly suitable for any child with neurodevelopmental conditions or sensory issues. So they use photographs when explaining periods. And I'm just going to show a picture. So if you don't like blood, just look away now. If you don't like blood, look away now. And they have pictures just of used tampons and used pads. And I've never actually seen pictures like that until I got this book. And it's very useful because then you know exactly what it's going to look like, and it really reduces anxiety. So yeah, photographs are more useful for neurodivergent children than abstract images. So in terms of kind of like what attitude people should teach towards periods, so an overly positive attitude can be a bit misleading. There's kind of this movement at the moment of trying to turn anything bad into a positive, and you know that it's just misleading and there's no need for it. Oftentimes periods are uncomfortable. So what's recommended is just a neutral, factual, open approach. And these ads on the television where, you know, once you buy the right tampon, you'll be able to do tennis and gymnastics and swimming or whatever. There's no need. If you want to just curl up and watch a movie, that's fine. So yeah, neutral, factual, open approach. There's no need to be overly positive about it. Right, so Robert Stewart, who wrote that book I just mentioned, she's done some really excellent research on periods and autistic people. And she talks about sensory issues in two ways. So there's the sensory experience of actually getting your period and how to cope with that, and what menstrual products to use. And so that's deciding if you want to use pads or tampons. She did some research and found that the most sensory friendly menstrual products were period underwear, fabric pads and menstrual cups. So that's what she found in her research. So you could start with them, but really it's just a process of trying to figure out you know, what suits a girl. But those could be useful to recommend or have around the school. And then the second thing about sensory issues is that there's some very preliminary evidence that if a child has, or if a person has sensory challenges, that they can become worse when they're menstruating or when they're on their week of their period. So just to be aware of that. So if someone has issues with you know, bright lights or noise, maybe that's more intense when they're on their period. So just to be aware of that and sensitive to the teenagers in your class who are possibly experiencing that. Right, so I'm continuing to try and figure out some of these things. I'm conducting the Transition to Teenager in Girls project, which is for all girls to take part in between 11 and 13 and a half years of age. Neurotypical girls with a diagnosis of autism, ADHD, and or dyspraxia, or if they're on the waiting list. So basically all girls. And in this project, we are looking at puberty and periods, but we're also looking at relationships and the school environment as well. So I really, really love if you could help with recruiting girls to take part. So all this would be me emailing you letters, invitation letter, and you just giving them to the girls in your class or in your school. And just to say that every girl in the class would get the same letter, so no one's being singled out, which means you don't have to spend time finding the person who needs the letter, and also no one's kind of singled out, like, why did she get a letter and I didn't? So please, if you could contact me, if it would be really, really helpful for our research. Right, finally, I just wanted to tell you about the Learning About Neurodiversity in Schools project. This is a project our colleagues here developed. It's a new curriculum for mainstream schools, and the point of it is to teach about neurodiversity and promote acceptance and understanding in children. So it's 100% free to use. And I emailed you earlier today a folder including some introductory materials for that. You can also look at the website there. So yeah, that's everything for today. I think we're going to start with some questions now.
Okay, sorry, Ailbhe, I'll get my video back on.
Great.
And then you can see me. So, right, we've just got one or two questions in the chat. So please do, if you've got anything else you kind of like to add. I know it's coming to the end of the day. So thank you for bearing with us as we've gone through it. I suppose well, actually, one of the questions, and just to say, so Sinead did put the links to the Hope Centre, and I put the links to Mind Room, so the Leans project, in the chat as well. So in case you're wondering what are those again, and Sinead put the author in as well, Robin Stewart. Just we've got that kind of details in the chat. So we've only had one or two questions. So one of them I was going to maybe direct to both Ailbhe and Sinead. And it was kind of asking about maybe kind of a gender bias, if that's fair to say. Is there a gender bias in boys who are kind of autistic, you know, as they're kind of during their kind of phase of puberty? Do you see kind of increased levels of like dysregulation, aggression? You know, what's the kind of differences maybe in profile in terms of maybe like regulation? So I don't know who wants to kind of have a go at answering that, Ailbhe.
Sorry, I think you started off and I thought the question meant something different. Are you saying differences between boys and girls during puberty?
Yeah, I think that's what maybe the person was kind of asking about. You know, do we see a bit of a gender bias, you know, in males kind of in terms of like autism, being autistic and being more aggressive leading up to puberty? Or is it something that you kind of encounter in both in terms of, you know, those wider under kind of concepts of emotional regulation?
Yeah, I think it's common to all genders. Yeah, going through puberty, the changes in your body, the hormonal changes, the psychological changes, the social changes. I think it's very stressful for all neurodivergent children. I think it's just that it hasn't really been researched in girls very much because historically girls haven't been diagnosed as much with autism, ADHD and dyspraxia. So maybe boys tend to be more aggressive because that's kind of how they're socialized or something. But I think the kind of the challenges of being neurodivergent and going through puberty, I think are similar enough. It's just very stressful.
Yeah, and I think it, you know, it probably depends on the complexity of their needs as well. Because I think, you know, that we've been talking about, you know, kind of sensory aspects and, you know, how it all fits together. So I think so sometimes it's hard to just kind of generalize it to one specific neurodevelopmental disorder or one specific bias. I think we know from research that there's a lot of research that tends to be more with autistic boys. That's just naturally, but it's evolved over time. We've got a few more kind of questions about puberty. Just do we have any kind of resources that are suitable for kind of more intellectual disability?
Yeah, on the Hope website, yeah, there is loads of resources there. So yeah, there is a PDF on children with ID, and then there is a section on autism as well. So yeah, I think there should be, hopefully you can find something suitable there.
Yeah,
and a lot of the EPIC activities can be done with children with intellectual impairment. They're very much game and activity based.
Yeah, we've got, sorry, the person's come back just to say that they meant boys with a condition and a neurodivergent condition against boys who are neurotypical.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, no, that was just a misunderstanding.
Yeah,
I think though, yeah, sorry, Ailbhe, you go on ahead.
I think I read an article about that. My area is on girls, so I don't know, but I did read one article about that, and yeah, definitely, I think puberty is definitely harder for neurodivergent boys than typical boys. Yeah, definitely.
I think in general, what we found in EPIC is that often children, particularly if they have ADHD or other difficulties that are associated with emotion regulation, what you tend to see is the aggression. But what we're really focusing on our research is the factors that's leading to that, because it can be very frustrating for them being in a class environment, for example, and not understanding why they're getting into trouble, because they just don't know the steps to start the task, or they might be able to start it but can't stay on it. And then we often see this behavior, this emotional dysregulation, and often it comes from frustration. And that's why we really advocate having this dialogue with the child about understanding their difficulties, and rather than becoming dysregulated, actually being able to navigate that. And also the really importance of movement breaks and fidget toys and things that they can do when, for example, a task changes. And for example, especially if they're autistic, that's when you'll find a flash point, that they find that when a task has changed in the classroom environment, they're just not coping with that change. So they're acting aggressive. And it's about actually just helping them understand, yes, the change can be difficult, and how can we navigate that when things change so that the aggression is reduced.
Okay, thank you. So what we've kind of two other areas, just one about what's the kind of role of CAMS in supporting kind of disability identity and explaining that. And then we've got a question on kind of gender, and young people who are questioning their gender at the point of puberty. So I'll maybe just start about the kind of what is the role of CAMS in supporting those conversations. I suppose for any child who and family who's going to kind of CAMS, they're entering a kind of assessment process. And sometimes at the end of that process, what they're coming out with is maybe a diagnosis, and sometimes they're not coming out with a diagnosis as well. And it mightn't be specified. They might recognize that there's some kind of neurodevelopmental differences that might kind of map onto a diagnosis, or it might not. Very much in the appointments and the feedback kind of process of CAMS, they are kind of recognising, and there is that kind of shift, certainly within Scotland, about talking about, neurodevelopmental conditions as a whole, and recognising that we live in a neurodiverse society, and that a young person maybe could consider themselves as neurodivergent. So I think what they're helping to do is kind of move through that process with the young person. Sometimes the follow-up is just explaining what that might look like, and if they have a diagnostic label, what is that, and giving resources. Probably it'd be fair to say it mightn't be an extensive piece of work, but there's definitely a lot of signposting and conversation around it. I think it's an extension of that. Sometimes it's maybe hard to get that from kind of CAMS, but obviously asking for any letters, any reports through school, and having a conversation about, with school as well, about how to kind of support that into the school context is really important. And asking those questions, with the parent, have you had a conversation? What's been said already? What would be helpful? And I think what we're at the point of kind of recognizing within the kind of neurodiverse, the neurodiversity movement is actually we should be using different labels. We should be kind of just explaining what they are. That it doesn't make, just because somebody has a label, we obviously know that's not them. It doesn't make up the sum of them. They're more than that, but it's explaining what it looks like. And I think that's the connection with, EPIC, that we've been talking about that profile and understanding those strengths and differences as well. I think there's another CAMS question coming in as well, just recognizing that, yeah, I think there's a recognition that there's been a higher presentation like traditionally in ASD. I think that's to do actually with how they've previously carried out their assessment processes. For some CAMS, depending where you are within the UK and Ireland, they've been either very specifically led by ASD or ADHD. We've got long waiting lists. So sometimes you end up having a gender bias where more boys have been identified. And I think there's that, in literature, but we recognize that that's not always kind of representative of what actually ASD can look like and how it can impact a young person as well. I hope that's okay. I'm going to come back in terms of the gender questioning.
Yeah, I can answer on that.
Yeah, thank you, Ailbhe.
So that was from Kathy Weston. Yeah, so that's right. I read a paper about that recently. Autistic kids and kids with ADHD, or autistic people and people with ADHD, are more likely to be transgender or non-binary or gender non-conforming and gay as well. So that's just useful to know in itself. So if a child says, I think I'm transgender, you can just say, well, actually a lot of autistic kids feel that way. So you're not alone. In terms of resources, maybe Kathy, if you email me, maybe I can send you some papers. I don't know, I haven't seen anything about how to respond to a child in the school, but I can send you the things I've read on it and maybe have a little look again. So yeah. Yeah,
do you know what, Ailbhe, I know from schools that Mermaid organisation have been really good in terms of providing resources.
Okay.
And just, kind of going through the concepts and, just tapping into your local authorities as well in terms of local, kind of health boards, what resources are they using? Do they have any recommendations as well? We've just had a question come in just about FASD. Any resources? So in terms of, I suppose in Scotland, we have the fetal alcohol support and advisory team, so FASD, and we've got FASD Hub Scotland. In the rest of the UK as well, we've got, and these are all kind of, you can kind of look up those titles, put them in Google, and you'll find the organisations. Now, FASD Hub Scotland, they've got a lot of resources for parents and educational professionals, just kind of explaining what it is. There's training available through FASD. And we have NoFAS, kind of the national kind of organisation as well. And they've got a lot of resources, and where it talks about me and my FASD. And there's lots of cartoons. So we actually, once you start to kind of explore different organisations, there'll be lots in there, to share with teachers, to share with parents, to share, whoever that team is around that child, and for staff as well to access. Okay, just looking at, thank you. Sinead's just responding. So in terms of deicde, dyspraxia, now we had a lot of questions, I know last night, Sinead, from parents about kind of, and they were talking about diagnostic specific, and that's part of it, because we've got the diagnosis, things like that, Dyspraxia Foundation. But I think you made a really helpful comment. You were talking about, was the ADHD organisation? Is that right?
Yeah.
Sinead?
So the ADHD Foundation it goes well beyond an ADHD focus. They're now calling themselves the Neurodiversity charity. So they've got lots of resources. They actually have the EPIC booklets, but they've got a lot of other booklets. The Dyspraxia Foundation is also very useful. And the Dyspraxia Foundation in particular highlights that motor difficulties are just one component of deicde dyspraxia, and actually there's a lot of cognitive and other difficulties.
Yeah, I was just going to say again, if anyone wants to be invited to other events like this, just email me and I can add you to the mailing list. And then before we go, if the people joined late, would you mind just putting in the chat what school you're from, if it's a primary or secondary school, where it is, and how you heard about the event, because it's just useful to know when we're planning these events. Right, so it's just 5 now, so I think we should wrap it up.
Yeah, so,
Oh yeah, I'll just put my email in the chat.
sorry, I disappeared there. I'm afraid of my life there. I think thanks very much to everybody. Thank you for the comments as well. Did you? I think,
Oh, Miranda's going a bit.
This is a
funny.
process. This is a learning. Oh, am I sorry? Oh, I'm unstable.
Okay, you're back now. Go on.
Okay, I was just saying thanks very much for any comments that you're posting. I think it's fair to say we're all on a learning journey with neurodiversity and understanding neurodivergence a bit better. So thanks for joining us tonight.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.